school rotation system could create a lost generation of pupils. That's according to education experts. The coronavirus pandemic has changed many facets of life, with schools also adopting new ways of teaching to curb the spread of the virus and limit exposure. What pupils have done is attend classes on alternative days while they're still expected to work at home on other days. The University of Stellenbosch's Professor Nic Spaull joins me to unpack the potential long-term impact on the current crop of school-going children. Prof, thank you so much for making time on the lead this afternoon. So this rotational system that the Education Department is using, what are these long-term negative consequences on pupils?
Sure. So when schools were reopened last year, when children were allowed to go back to school, in no-fee schools, actually in most schools, they only went back to school every second day because of rotational timetables in order to practice social distancing. So now in 2021, although most fee-charging schools, which only make up about 15% of schools in South Africa, all children that attend those schools are attending Monday to Friday. Whereas for kids in no-fee schools, they're only attending school every second or every third day. So in a sense, schools are still closed for them every second day. Now, we know from learning assessments that were done at the start of this year, comparing the children, grade 1 and grade 2 children in 2021, and compared them to children in 2019, we can see that children lost 50 to 75% of a year of learning in 2020. And if we continue those projections until June, it's as high as a year of schooling that has been lost. So the average grade 3 child in 2021 knows the same as the average grade 2 child in 2019.
Yeah, so we know that the primary school children are set to return to school on a full-time basis next month. Is the impact, Prof, only on primary school children, or are pupils in secondary and high school also likely to be affected?
So all pupils will be affected. I mean, some of the projections that have been done looking at the matric results show that we're only likely to get back to our pre-pandemic trend of matric outcomes, so the number of passes, bachelor passes, etc. There's some estimates that point to the 2030 as being when we would get back to the same trajectory that we were on before the pandemic. So it's certainly not only primary schools, but remember that children that are in grade 1, 2, and grade 3 they don't know how to read yet, they don't know how to learn by themselves, so they are obviously going to be the most affected by schools being closed, whereas children in high school could potentially do homework, they could use cell phones or take home books that they could learn from. However, we still think that learning losses are extremely high for high school students. And in my view, when primary schools open at the end of July, high schools should also be fully open.
Yeah. What options are there for government, Prof? Because a lot of schools don't have the capacity to have pupils every day. There are capacity constraints, especially at no-fee paying schools. So the only option that the government says they have is, let's keep it safe, spread the pupils, and try catch up as fast as we can with the curriculum.
Sure. So I think there's two things to point out there. The first one is that COVID does not affect children in the same way that it affects adults. So if we think of the 58,000 deaths that we've had in South Africa today, less than half of 1% have been amongst children under the age of 20. So basically, children don't catch and spread COVID, and they certainly don't die from COVID at the same rate that older adults do. So that's the first reason why primary schools are going back, but the argument is actually the same for high schools, particularly the lower grades of high schools. But there's another argument that there's no evidence that schools are sites of spread. So if we look at teacher mortality data from teacher payroll data, so when a teacher dies, they're obviously removed from the government payroll database, we can see that while there has been an excess deaths amongst teachers, this follows the trends of overall excess deaths in the population in South Africa. It does not follow the opening and closing dates of school. There's no relationship between when schools were open or when they were closed and teachers dying from COVID-19, which is what we would expect if schools were sites of spread. Instead, it's the community where we see the spread that's happening.
Yeah, and often you hear people say, yeah, we understand that children, COVID doesn't affect the children the same way that it affects adults, but it's these children, when they get it, then they take it home to their parents who may have comorbidities. Let's talk about the vaccination of teachers. It's expected to start on Wednesday. Do you think that is progress that can help us go back to normal, so to speak?
Most definitely. I think that it's definitely a good sign that we are prioritizing teachers in the vaccination program. So there's about 400,000 teachers in South Africa. There are 500,000 vaccines. So I think there will be additional workers that are linked to the schools that aren't teachers that would get the vaccines. And it's certainly a positive development. It means that all teachers should be vaccinated by the end of July when schools reopen. And I think it's even further reason why both primary and high schools should open in full.
All right. Thank you so much for making time, Prof. That's the University of Stellenbosch's Professor Nic Spaull.